And what a hell of a sight that was. From there we knew in the general direction where we were supposed to be, where our battalion was supposed to be.
We were out in the open sea. It was pretty rough at that time because we was open. We were in a landing craft tank, and we had our 2 armored bulldozers in front that belonged to the 6th Field Engineer Regiment with the sappers with them. And we had 2 sections of mortars, which means that each section had 2 carriers with a trailer behind one of them, and to carry extra ammo and extra rations. The rations were supposed to be good for 2 weeks, just in case we didn't get any. We had compo boxes and bread. Bread's supposed to last for 21 days. I asked the service corps guy how come it was could last 21 days. He said it's got formaldehyde in it. So whether they meant it, so that means that if something happened to us, at least we were partly embalmed.
And then break at dawn. It was just break at dawn when we seen this landmark. We knew it was France right away.
And when we arrived off the coast, there was still a lot of clouds, not raining anymore, somewhat broken up, but still a lot of wind. And but the wind had died down a fair bit, but it was still very choppy.
Meanwhile, members of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion were still trying to reach the rendezvous zone.
And we pushed it for another 2 or 3 hours. That's when we went up with a column of troops who turned out to be a 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion column, who were heading for what we called the brickworks, or the crossroad, or the Mesnil, as we called it in those days.
Everybody was to not return, but head for La Menil to the high ground and form our defense line. Now, the men staggered in there for weeks. They were still coming in. We know that some men, individuals, were, if they were caught by any Nazi troops, they were shot. If they were caught by regular army, they could surrender if they were trapped.
We were ready to be airborne at about 5:30, so we were airborne at dawn that morning. Below, the waves were intense on the water, but the whole sector, all the way across from Portsmouth and Southampton, those are with current, with ships, boats, vehicles of any kind on the water.
By that time, we had consolidated around our rendezvous point, which was for us at this brickworks near this sort of village of Le Mesnil.
And there weren't too many of the Germans in that particular area at that time. We weren't there very long before we were digging. We were in a holding situation. We were to protect that flank so that the Germans couldn't get reinforcements down to the beachhead.
Many of the men traveled across the channel in larger ships and began loading onto the landing craft just off the shore of Normandy.
From that big ship, we got down into the little one, then we went in.
Climbing down the scramble nets on the side of the ship and into the salt craft. Of course, the salt craft were lowered before we got down there, fortunately.
And the whole ship would have these scrambling nets, and I almost fell in because the waves were coming up. And I went to step in, and the boat was down. So I was lucky I was hanging on.
Am I going to get on this thing without falling in the water? But after it was all over, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be.
Then it took quite a long time for all those ships, landing craft, to get out and get in a row.
For some unknown reason, likely we were ahead of schedule, they pulled us around in a great big circle, and when we did come in, daylight was pretty well on.
As the invasion forces approached, the bombing of the coastal emplacements by the Navy began.
The battleships that were out further were firing inland, and the shelling that was going on overhead was tremendous.
And as we moved slowly in towards the beach, HMS Rodney, which was one of the Royal Navy battleships, was behind us, and at about 6 o'clock they started pushing in their heavy armament.
I remember that these shells were going over, they sounded like freight trains.
They really sounded like a lot of rush, you know.
But when those big naval guns let blast, wow.
And of course, we didn't pay that much attention to what was going on behind us because the main thing was me. I had to survive.
It was, I guess to say the least, very, very, very noisy.
In fact, they gave us little bags, like Simpsons Eaton's bags, and that was to bring your breakfast up, which a lot of them did. In fact, on our way in, one man went little bonkers and tried to get over the side, and we had to grab him and pull him back in again. Well, he didn't have time to think. You're frightened.
Well, first, would give us a mug of rum. Let me go get him, guy. And then after we got on the landing craft, just before we got on the landing craft, our commanding officer said, well, you must remember, you guys are fighters, and you go out there and get them. But I don't think none of you guys will be coming home. We told them we were all coming home. We go in there and we'll kick butts.
And at the same time, the Air Force were flying over us, and I've never since seen so many planes at one time.
The continuous bombing meant around-the-clock arrivals and departures of bombers in England.
Once we landed, of course, we turned the taxied in, shut down, and then we went into debriefing. The intelligence people debriefed us with all the questions that they had to ask and to determine just how successful the trip had been and all this type of thing. And then we went to bed.
If I recall correctly, we took out some gun placements, and there were several houses and other buildings that were our particular target. And so we were bombarding from 7 to about 7:45, because H hour, which is when the troops were to hit the beach, we had to be stopped bombarding before that.
The invasion was to receive complete aerial support from Fighter Command.
I probably took off about 7:30 to be sure to be there by 8. I was on the first show. We would get out over there at 8 o'clock, and we patrolled Juno and Sword.
Well, as we got off and onto our light landing crafts, we circled and circled, and finally we started to come in, and I think the Germans were more surprised, and they couldn't believe what was going on.
From what they told us, it was one of the roughest days they'd had on the English Channel in something like 60 to 65 years.
The ramp on the craft was so high, I guess it'd be about 8 foot high. We couldn't look over that, and so we just had to wait and wonder what was going to happen.
The Germans were firing at you, and the shells were coming at you, and I stood up in the middle row, and they were asking me what I saw. And I said, oh, the shoreline is only about 1/8 of an inch high. So as we kept coming in, and all the time, getting bigger, it's bigger and bigger. And finally I heard this whang coming over the top of my head, crack, 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 crack. And then I got down. I couldn't get down any further because of this guy's back in front of me. And my pouches were sitting on top of his.
That's when they're coming over your head, it's a snapping sound, You know that keep your head down or it's going to snap into you. The one that you don't hear is the one that gets you. While they were opening up, the big LCTs were loaded with these rockets, and they had we were told about 3,000 rockets on each one of these LCTs. I remember seeing this tank that was sinking. It had this helium or apparatus around to keep it floating. That's a Sherman tank. But they were climbing out of it because it was leaking, and they were trying to get everybody out. And we got closer. The front end of our landing craft was hit by an HE shell that came through where the sailor was in the compartment to lower the ramp of the LCT. And he came out, he was all bloodied, and people said get down because we could hear all this crack, 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 which is the small arms fire going over your head.
The Royal Winnipeg Rifles were the first to land on Mike Sector, under fire from the largest concentration of pillboxes along the beaches.
After we got on there, and then we hit the beach, and then that's where really the trouble started.
We knew there were these pillboxes, there's 5 of them, and we even picked out the spot where we're going to set up our mortars on the beach.
And then they were way up on the hill as you went in. There was the hill started, and they fired down from there.
We had a good idea of what we're up against, but they kept saying, well, it's second-rate troops, it's people who had ulcers and something wrong with them, flat feet. But you put anybody, regardless of what condition, in behind a trigger, they can pull it.
Landing craft is something the tide was ahead of us. And when the landing craft came, it circled and dropped his. Then you had to get off.
And then the hollering of the commander of the boat, everybody get off the boat, start getting off.
When they open to get on, well, that means go. Don't stand. Or else if you stood right there, the machine guns are going to be at you.
When that carrier went in, it was built to go 4 feet. It just sank right in, and it pulled the trailer off with it. The next one in was ours, the same bloody thing. We just went in the water, and we just sank right down.
When I jumped out, you had some water up to here, and you have to hold your rifle up so you wouldn't get it. But my rifle was no good anyway when I hit the beach. That was the biggest problem. How can you fight no rifle and all these machine guns and these pellet boxes, these cement? So we had to use our grenades.
Must have gotten right in the path of the LCAs come in, because one of them sort of brushed my shoulder and I sort of went underwater, and I said, screw it. So then I struck out, but when I finally got touching my feet, the landing crafts that had passed, the fellows that got out, there's people who were in the water. Some were face down. So you running towards the beach, just grab a couple. Bob Hussey, he grabbed a couple, pulled them in. He was doing the same as I.
If you stayed still, you were a target.
A lot of things happened. A lot of people died in that time.
Well, we figured once we got to the land, it was much better than in the water, eh? Because you know yourself when you come on the beach, what have you got to cover?
All the time we're thinking, well, at least I was thinking, I've got nothing. What are we going to do? Where's our mortars? We got nothing to support anybody.
If we could get in them, hey, we get one guy jump up on you. There's 2 guys jump, and then one on top getting on, then one trying to throw the grenade and make sure it falls inside. That's how we have to get the guns out.
By sniper fire and Gunson, they kept picking away at him and wounded him a second time. And that must have been pretty rough on him, because his brother was in the same boat. He was killed right on the beach, right with him.
So it didn't matter how many we lost. We still had to go.
This was the hour that all of the first wave landings would occur, and when the most men would die. The resistance was severe, and the casualties were in the same ratio as those on Omaha Beach.
We were in about 1,500 yards ashore. We could see a fair amount, and you could see them hitting the beach and the ramps going down and plowing their way up on the beach.
You could see some of the tanks coming. They had tanks that would float, and they were coming ashore.
And then when we got over there to patrol, we were patrolling the beach. Looked down, we could see the guys coming out of these landing craft. The big door go down, and they come out of the water about up to here, and they had their rifles up, keep them dry.
We came back up to the beach, and we went up and down the British, Canadian, and British beaches at 500 feet, just as the first landing craft were coming in. So we watched them come in, and we could see out to the horizon. There was black smoke on the horizon from the battleships out there firing.
But it was just unimaginable, the organization that they put together for that, because everything had to be right on time.
It was just as the first landing craft were coming in. We saw some get out and charge up the beach. There were enormous explosions, of course.
We could see people heading for a certain point. We could see it so well defended that they were going to run into a machine gun nest or something like that. We couldn't do a damn thing about it.
Each hour is when the assault infantry were coming in, our guys from our rifle companies.